True, there is a common yet dangerous belief among many Christians that devotion to God means constant sacrifice, relentless service, and complete self-denial, even at the cost of one's well-being. Many believe that to be a faithful servant of Christ, they must always put others first, even if it means running themselves into exhaustion. But what if this is not what God intended? When Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment, he responded with something profound: love your neighbor as yourself. That last part is often overlooked. It implies a balance. One cannot truly love others without first understanding how to love and care for oneself. Yet too many of us pour out endlessly without ever allowing ourselves to be refilled, thinking that neglecting our own needs is a sign of holiness. Even Jesus, who carried the weight of the world's redemption, took time for rest. He withdrew from crowds, sought solitude, and prayed. He understood something we often forget, that a depleted soul cannot give abundantly. A weary body cannot labor effectively. A heart running on empty cannot overflow with love. If you never tend to your own well-being, what will be left to offer others? A tree that is stripped of its leaves without a season of renewal will not bear fruit again. A candle that is never replenished with wax will soon burn out. So why do we assume we can serve God well while running on fumes? God does not desire for His children to live drained and exhausted lives. He calls us to stewardship, not just of our time and resources, but of ourselves, because when we are whole, we love more fully, serve more effectively, and live in the fullness of the life He designed for us. From the very beginning, God established the principle of stewardship. When He formed the world, He gave humanity dominion over creation, not to exploit it, but to care for it. This stewardship does not only apply to the earth, but also to our own bodies, minds, and souls. Everything we have is a gift from God, including our health, our strength, and our ability to think and feel. And like any good gift, it comes with responsibility. In the Bible, we are told that our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, meant to be honored and kept pure. This is not merely a call to avoid sin, but an instruction to care for ourselves as vessels of God's presence. If we were given a physical temple to maintain, we would not let it crumble from neglect. We would repair what is broken, cleanse what has been tainted, and ensure it remains strong and worthy of its purpose. Why then do so many treat their own well-being as an afterthought? The world often encourages two extremes, either complete self-indulgence or total self-neglect. But God's way is different. He calls for balance. Just as the land was given a Sabbath to rest, so too are we called to rhythms of renewal. When Israel was commanded to let the fields lie fallow in certain years, it was not to deprive them of harvest, but to ensure continued fruitfulness. Likewise, our bodies and souls require rest, care, and nourishment to remain strong for the work ahead. In the Bible, we are reminded that even the most dedicated servants of God needed moments of renewal. Elijah, after his greatest victory, fell into despair and exhaustion until an angel provided food and rest. Moses, a leader burdened with the responsibility of guiding an entire nation, was counseled to delegate his work, lest he wear himself out completely. These were not acts of weakness, but necessary adjustments for endurance. If God, in His wisdom, made provision for His people to be strengthened, why do we resist the same for ourselves? Many believe that self-care is selfish, but in truth, it is an act of obedience. When we care for our health, we acknowledge that our lives belong to God. When we seek wisdom, we honor the mind He has given us. When we rest, we trust that He remains in control even when we pause. There is a reason Jesus Himself took time away from crowds, found solitude to pray, and allowed moments of stillness amid His ministry. He did not need rest because He was weak, but because He was demonstrating what it means to live in full reliance on the Father. To neglect ourselves is to deny the responsibility given to us by God. A weary, sick, or broken vessel cannot carry the fullness of His calling. Just as a shepherd must ensure his own strength to protect the flock, so too must we care for ourselves to serve effectively. In the Bible, we are said to run with endurance the race set before us. But no runner finishes well without preparation. No soldier enters battle without first strengthening himself, and no servant can pour out what has not first been filled. This is not about indulgence, it is about wisdom. Just as a lamp must be refilled with oil to continue shining, so too must we be renewed to fulfill our purpose. The greatest offering we can give to God is not our exhaustion, but our faithfulness. Faithfulness that includes caring for the life He has entrusted to us. Loving others is at the heart of the Christian life. It is the command that sums up the law and the prophets, the very essence of what it means to walk in the way of Christ. Yet hidden within this command is something many overlook: God's expectation that we love ourselves as well. In the Bible, we are said to love our neighbor as ourselves. This phrase is often quoted to emphasize our duty toward others, but it also carries an unspoken assumption that a person who does not know how to love themselves will struggle to love others well. If a heart is filled with self-condemnation, how can it pour out kindness? If a person sees themselves as unworthy of care, how will they genuinely extend care to another? God does not command anything that He Himself does not model. His love for humanity is deep, intentional, and sacrificial. He does not see His creation as worthless, but as valuable beyond measure. If God, in His infinite wisdom, sees us as worth loving, how can we justify treating ourselves with neglect or disdain? To despise ourselves is to reject the worth He has placed upon us. To treat ourselves carelessly is to contradict the very love He has freely given. This is not a call to arrogance or self-centeredness, but to an honest recognition of our worth in God's eyes. In the Bible, we are said to be fearfully and wonderfully made, created with purpose, knit together with care. Every breath we take is intentional. Every gift we possess is designed for a reason. To love ourselves means to acknowledge this truth, to see ourselves as God sees us, to honor the work of His hands, and to carry ourselves with the dignity He has given. Jesus demonstrated this balance perfectly. He was the most selfless person to walk the earth, yet He never diminished His own value. He was humble, yet confident in His identity. He served tirelessly, yet never allowed Himself to be devalued by the expectations of others. He gave everything, yet took the time to be strengthened, because He understood that true love, whether for oneself or for others, flows from a place of security in God. Many think of self-love as a worldly concept, something opposed to humility. But there is a difference between selfishness and godly self-regard. Selfishness places one's desires above all else, while godly self-regard recognizes one's worth while still living in service to others. The two are not opposites. In fact, one enables the other. A person who is constantly drained, burdened by self-doubt, or consumed by guilt cannot be fully present in loving their neighbor. They will either give begrudgingly or with expectations of return. But one who is secure in their worth, who understands they are loved by God, will give freely, without condition. In the Bible, we are told to let our light shine before others. A light that is neglected, left without oil, or hidden beneath a basket cannot illuminate anything. It is not humility to extinguish the flame that God has placed within us. It is not righteousness to deny ourselves the love and care that God has commanded. To be a light, we must first be willing to receive the fuel that keeps us burning. Loving yourself is not about pride, it is about embracing the truth of who you are in Christ. When we see ourselves rightly, we are able to love others more deeply, serve with greater joy, and walk in the fullness of the calling God has placed upon our lives. Because the greatest commandment does not just call us to love, it calls us to love as God loves, starting with the very person He created us to be. Jesus was the perfect example of what it means to live a life of balance, completely devoted to others, yet never neglecting Himself. He healed the sick, taught the multitudes, and poured out His life in service. But He also withdrew when He needed rest. He was fully God, yet in His humanity, He demonstrated that even the most faithful servant must take time to replenish. In the Bible, we are said to see Jesus frequently stepping away from the crowds, going to a quiet place to pray, and finding solitude even when people still sought Him. This was not avoidance, nor was it a failure to care for those in need. It was wisdom. He understood that his ability to serve was strengthened when he spent time alone with the Father, away from the demands of the world. If the Son of God himself needed moments of renewal, how much more do we? Some might argue that ministry never stops, that there is always more to do, more people to help, more needs to meet. And this is true. The world will never run out of brokenness. But this does not mean we should run ourselves into exhaustion trying to fix it all at once. Even Jesus did not heal everyone in one day. He did not meet every need at every moment. He trusted in the timing and provision of the Father, knowing that the work of the kingdom was not meant to rest on one person's shoulders alone. One of the clearest examples of this was after Jesus fed the 5,000. It was a moment of great power and compassion, a miracle that demonstrated God's provision. But what did Jesus do immediately afterward? In the Bible, we are said to see him sending the crowds away and retreating to a mountain by himself to pray. The same hands that had just multiplied the loaves and fish were now folded in solitude, seeking strength from the Father. This was not weakness, it was wisdom. Even on the night before his crucifixion, when the weight of the world's sin was pressing upon him, Jesus did not simply press forward in agony without seeking renewal. He withdrew to the Garden of Gethsemane. He prayed. He poured out his heart before God. And in that time of stillness, he was strengthened for the greatest act of love the world would ever know. Yet many of us live as if stopping to rest is a failure. We think that unless we are constantly moving, constantly working, constantly giving, we are not doing enough. But Jesus did not teach this. His life was marked by a rhythm, giving and withdrawing, serving and resting, pouring out and being refilled. To ignore this rhythm is to ignore the very pattern he set for us. In the Bible, we are reminded that God gives his beloved rest. This is not just about sleep, it is about renewal of the soul. Rest is not idleness, it is preparation. It is in moments of stillness that God strengthens us, speaks to us, and realigns our hearts with his purpose. Jesus showed us that self-care is not an interruption of ministry, it is what sustains it. If we are to follow his example, we must recognize that taking time to rest, to pray, to step away from the constant demands of life, is not an act of selfishness, but of obedience. Because even Jesus, who held the power of heaven within him, knew that a weary servant cannot give what they do not have. Many people believe that neglecting themselves in service to others is a noble sacrifice, but in reality, an empty vessel cannot pour anything out. When we continuously give without taking time to replenish, we do not just harm ourselves, we limit our ability to serve effectively. God does not call us to exhaustion. He calls us to endurance. In the Bible, we are said to see examples of faithful servants who, when they neglected themselves, became weak, discouraged, and ineffective. Elijah, after calling down fire from heaven and proving God's power, immediately fell into despair. He fled to the wilderness, convinced that he was alone and that his work was meaningless. What did God do? He did not rebuke him for feeling exhausted. He provided food, water, and rest before calling him forward again. It was only after Elijah was physically and spiritually renewed that he could continue the work set before him. Moses too learnt this lesson. He took on the responsibility of leading the Israelites entirely by himself, judging every dispute, answering every question, carrying every burden. But his father-in-law Jethro warned him that this would lead to burnout. In the Bible, we are said to see Jethro advising Moses to delegate responsibilities, to share the burden, to recognize that he was never meant to carry it all alone. Moses heeded the advice, and in doing so, he became a better leader, no longer weighed down by exhaustion. Even the strongest people will break if they push beyond what they were created to handle. The enemy does not always attack through obvious sin. Sometimes he uses exhaustion, knowing that a weary believer is more vulnerable to doubt, frustration, and discouragement. When we are physically drained, our patience wears thin. When we are emotionally exhausted, our love grows cold. When we are spiritually empty, our faith feels distant. This is why caring for ourselves is not just beneficial, it is necessary for fulfilling God's calling on our lives. In the Bible, we are reminded that those who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength, that they will rise up on wings like eagles, run and not grow weary, walk and not faint. But how often do we actually allow ourselves to wait on the Lord? Instead, we push forward in our own strength, ignoring the warning signs of exhaustion, convincing ourselves that rest is a luxury rather than a divine provision. A farmer does not expect a field to produce an endless harvest without allowing the soil to rest. A blacksmith does not keep hammering iron without pausing to cool and temper it. Yet many of us expect our bodies, minds, and spirits to function without ever stepping back to be renewed. But God created us with limits, not as a punishment, but as a reminder that we are dependent on Him. This is not just about avoiding burnout. It is about honoring God with our whole selves. We serve best when we serve from a place of strength, not depletion. We love best when we love from a heart that has been filled. We give best when we give from an overflow, not from the scraps of what is left. Neglecting yourself does not make you a better servant of God, it makes you a weaker one. But when you allow yourself to be restored, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, you are not only protecting your well-being, you are ensuring that your ministry, your relationships, and your faith remain strong. Because a tired, worn-out believer may still work, but a renewed, strengthened believer will thrive. And God did not call us to simply survive. He called us to flourish. One of the greatest misunderstandings about faith is the belief that self-sacrifice means complete self-neglect. Many believe that constantly giving, without rest or renewal, is a sign of true devotion. But in reality, when we ignore our own well-being, we are not just harming ourselves, we are failing to be good stewards of what God has given us. In the Bible, we are said to be stewards of all that God has entrusted to us. This includes not only our time, talents, and resources, but also our bodies, minds, and souls. If a person is given a garden to tend, they would not ignore it, allowing weeds to overrun it and the plants to wither. Instead, they would water it, nourish the soil, and remove anything that hinders its growth. Our lives are no different. God has given us the responsibility of caring for ourselves so that we can continue to bear fruit for His kingdom. Jesus illustrated this principle in the parable of the talents. Each servant was given something valuable, and the master expected them to manage it wisely. Those who invested and multiplied what they were given were rewarded, while the one who buried his talent out of fear was rebuked. This applies not only to our skills and resources, but also to the care of our own bodies and souls. When we misuse or neglect what God has entrusted to us, we fail in our responsibility as stewards. In the Bible, we are said to honor God with our bodies. This means treating ourselves with care, ensuring that we are healthy, whole, and able to continue the work He has called us to do. A person who ignores their own well-being may think they are being selfless, but in reality, they are limiting their ability to serve. A sick body cannot minister effectively. A weary mind cannot make wise decisions. A broken spirit cannot bring light to others. We see this principle in the way Jesus treated His disciples. When they returned from ministry, tired and overwhelmed, He did not immediately send them back into the crowds. Instead, He told them to come away to a quiet place and rest. He knew that they could not continue to serve if they were depleted. If Jesus, who had all authority, saw the necessity of rest for those He trained, why do we so often ignore it for ourselves? The world often values productivity over well-being. It encourages constant striving, endless work, and the idea that our worth is measured by how much we can accomplish. But God's ways are different. He calls us to fruitfulness, not frantic busyness. He commands us to rest, not because He wants us to be idle, but because He knows that true strength comes from renewal. In the Bible, we are reminded that everything we do should be done for the glory of God. This includes how we care for ourselves. Eating well, sleeping enough, setting boundaries, and taking time to be refreshed are not acts of selfishness, but acts of obedience. They allow us to serve longer, love better, and live in the fullness of God's design. Neglecting ourselves is not a mark of holiness, it is a failure of stewardship. Just as an instrument must be tuned to play its best music, we must ensure that our bodies and souls are well maintained so that we can continue to fulfill our purpose. When we care for ourselves, we are not just preserving our health, we are honoring God, ensuring that we remain strong and ready for all He has called us to do. Life is filled with responsibilities, expectations, and demands that often pull people in many directions. There is always something to do, someone to help, another task waiting to be completed. In the midst of all this, it is easy to forget that God never intended for people to carry everything on their own. He calls His people to be faithful, but He does not expect them to be exhausted. He calls them to serve, but not at the cost of their own well-being. The idea that constantly working without rest is a sign of devotion is not from God. It is a burden people place on themselves. In the Bible, we are said to find rest in God, to come to Him when weary and burdened, and He will give rest. This is not just a suggestion, it is a promise. God knows that people are not infinite. They were created with limits, designed to need rest, renewal, and moments of stillness. Even the strongest will grow weary, but those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. Many believe they must push themselves beyond their limits to prove their faithfulness. But faithfulness is not measured by exhaustion. It is measured by obedience. And part of obedience is knowing when to step back and be renewed. Jesus demonstrated this truth in His own life. Though He had the power to heal every sick person, answer every question, and teach every moment, He did not. He took time to be alone with the Father, to rest, to pray, and to find renewal before continuing His mission. There were always more people in need, but He did not let the urgency of the world dictate His pace. He followed the Father's will, and that included moments of stillness. In the Bible, we are said to labor for the Lord, but also to do so with wisdom. A worker who never sharpens his tools will struggle to be effective. A warrior who never stops to regain his strength will falter in battle. A lamp that is never refilled with oil will eventually go out. God's desire is not for people to burn out, but to shine brightly for as long as they are called. This can only happen when they take care of what God has entrusted to them, including their own well-being. Many feel guilty for resting, as if taking care of themselves is selfish. But in the Bible, we are reminded that even the land was given a Sabbath, a time to rest and be restored so that it could produce fruit again. If God commanded rest for the earth, how much more does He desire it for His people? Rest is not a waste of time, it is an act of trust, acknowledging that God is in control. To live in God's purpose means to walk in His wisdom. That wisdom includes caring for the mind, body, and spirit, so that His work can be done with endurance, joy, and strength. If this message has encouraged you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who need to hear it.